Recôncavo Baiano. The night was thick and warm, the kind of heat that made the cane fields breathe and the moon look small and guilty. I saw what the colonel did at night, and the memory has been a weight on my chest ever since. There was one secret in the house grande that no one spoke of aloud, and I learned it by accident, with wet feet and a lantern that shook in my hand. If you listen closely, this is a truth the land tried to bury, and it is a truth that changed everything for me and for the people who had nowhere to turn. The lantern smelled of oil and dust, the wood floor of the corridor creaked like the bones of an animal, and beyond the high windows the cane swayed with a sound like low crying. The silence in the house grande was a living thing, and in it the colonel moved like a shadow with a glass in his hand and a bruise in his eyes. He was called Coronel Joaquim by the papers and by the men in town, but at night he became something else, a presence that took and justified itself with money and the small laws of the plantation. I had been the cook in the kitchen for the last 5 years. Mine, a face known by the pots and by the early coffee steam. Mine, a memory kept in the pockets of faded shirts. I never imagined that seeing one thing would cost me the life I had been building from the ashes of my childhood. There are secrets that once seen do not leave you. They live inside like a stone. She was younger than I was, smaller than most of the women who worked at the water trough, and her hands smelled always of soap and river mud. Her name was Rosa, and she had a laugh like clapping hands, quick and surprised. When the world of the plantation tightened, Rosa found small ways to soften it: a braid, a bowl of mango, a song at dusk. My life before that night can be told in 4 small frames. I was born near the mangroves, the child of a woman who hummed in a language my ears could not name, and a father I never saw. As a boy, I learned the measure of fear, the cadence of orders, the price of silence. I learned to count work by the rising and falling of the sun and the taste of cassava. When I was 12, I was sold at the market in Salvador and brought to this fazenda, where the house grande seemed to swallow the horizon. I grew into my body under o capataz Francisco, who whistled and corrected, under a lamp that never went out, and under the careful eyes Dona Lucia, who mended the shirts of the household, but looked the other way when the colonel passed through the kitchen. Loss followed me. My mother died with a name I could not pronounce on her lips. The only things I carried from her were a short prayer and a song. Those songs kept me whole until the night I saw what I saw. They connected me to a lineage I had been taught to forget, to the scent of atabaque drums at a hidden festa in the woods, to a stubborn word my mother used, libertad. When people asked me who I was, I answered with work, because that was easier. Inside me there was a larger map, a longing of belonging that had no address. That map carried me toward Rosa, toward a decision that would break a life and make another. The first invasion happened like a door closing softly behind a secret. I was bringing a pot of water to the pantry when the colonel called my name in a voice that was almost a command and almost a joke. He said, "Come here," and I stepped into the shadow of his library where the smell of leather and tobacco hung heavy. He was alone, the shutters half drawn, the moonlight slicing the room into silver lines. He smiled once, a flash that did not reach his eyes. He said, "Sit," and I did because refusal was a dangerous thing. He asked where I had come from. I said, "From the mangroves, sir." He laughed. He reached out and told me I could be of use in other ways, his hand finding my wrist like a plane. I pulled away. He said, "You know I can do whatever I want with what I own." I said, "My life is not for sale." He said, "Is that what you think?" He said, "You could disappear, or you could belong." I said, "Belonging without choice is not belonging at all." He leaned closer. He said in a low voice, "Then you will learn." The exchange was short,
but it contained many small violences, each a promise wrapped in decorum. The pantry tasted suddenly of stale sugar and fear. The light from the lantern trembled against the colonel's nattles and the portrait of a white man who had never known our names. After he let me go, the world of the plantation seemed recalibrated. The walls watched more sharply. The capataz Francisco walked by the kitchen door and did not meet my eyes. Donna Lucia called for more firewood, as if the house had not just been a stage for a theft from my body. I kept the memory hidden for weeks, until Rosa pressed her hand to mine and, using a small whisper, said, "Tell me," and the act of confessing felt like stepping over a ledge. The routine that followed was a calendar of small violences and a hiding place of small mercies. Mornings smelled of cassava and sweat. The house grande rang with porcelain clicks, and the servants moved like ghosts. At night, the colonel moved through rooms.
He would send messages under the pretense of needing sugar or a changed shirt, and the capataz Francisco would nod and do as he was told. The community worked in patterns. There was Padre Manuel at the chapel, who gave thin sermons and heavy absolution. Rosa with her river song, Zay the atabaque player who kept a beat for the hidden festas, Maria the midwife who mended more than bodies, Juan the muleteer who carried messages under the cloak of darkness, and Anna the seamstress who stitched secrets into hems. Each of them did something small to keep us alive. My refuge was not just Rosa in a clandestine embrace. It was the tree beside the senzala where we carved names into the bark, where we traded stolen mangoes and shared the hush of our plans. It was the grave of my mother where I spoke a vow. The smell of wood smoke from the senzala, the bruise color of dusk, the taste of stolen cassava roasted under a gray sky, the sound of distant atabaque drums through the palms, and the roughness of Rosa's palm in mine were anchors. We learned to hide laughter, to pass messages by the rhythm of footfalls, to read a day by the arrangement of plates on the veranda. The community kept a ledger of favors and deaths, and every small favor was an act of resistance. Then came the elevation of stakes. Rosa announced she was with child in the hush of a kitchen where the air hung like syrup. Her hand covered her belly as if shielding a secret flame. Joy and terror arrived at once. The news moved through the plantation like smoke. When the colonel heard of the pregnancy, he changed. He called me to the office and laid down an ultimatum like a contract. He said, "Either you agree to my terms, or she will be sold to a buyer in the South." I said, "You cannot sell my child." He answered, "Everything here is an object." I said, "People are not objects." He laughed and said, "Sentiment is for the weak." There was a long silence, as if the room measured the length of our lives. Padre Manuel knocked on the office door and asked if everything was all right, and the colonel said, "Nothing to see here." The capataz Francisco stood by the window and whistled, as if his life had not just been balanced on a coin. I had a choice: submit and watch Rosa leave, or refuse and risk everything. The decision formed like a storm. I remembered my mother's song and the word libertade that had lived in my ear since childhood. The word felt like a blade and a balm. I told the colonel no, and my voice was thin and steady. He said, "Then you will run." I said simply, "Then we will run." The room seemed to tilt. The air became heavy with future possibility and imminent danger. In that hour, Rosa's small laugh returned, brittle and brave, and together we packed a single sack with a knife, some dry cassava, a scrap of the atabic skin, and the old prayer. The escape was a night carved by breath and root. We left when the moon was a sliver, when the dogs slept and the overseers believed their own sleep. The scent of wet earth rose as we slipped through the cane, the blade of the grass cutting at our legs, the rain of earlier showers still cooling the soil. At first the chase was human and quiet. The capataz Francisco had sent men with lanterns while the household pretended ignorance. I heard one shout, "There!" and the tones clattered like broken plates. A dog barked, a pack of dogs took the track, and their noses were merciless, the sound of nails on soil like rain on tin. We crossed a river that cut like ice, and Rosa cried out because the child felt the cold and the shock. Juan the muleteer had left a spare mule by the river on a prearranged night in case of emergencies, a small kindness that smelled of oil and hay. We mounted and rode through the dark, the trees forming caverns, and twice we had to throw ourselves into ditches while men on horseback passed, their laughter swallowed by the woods. At one point a posse closed behind us. Their voices were close. A man called my name like a challenge. My heart hammered against my ribs, and the taste of blood rose in my mouth. The dogs were nearly upon us. We climbed a bank and threw our mule into the growing wind. Rosa held tightly and whispered a song my mother used to hum. The sound of the song became a beacon that guided us to a narrow path whose mouth was hidden by ferns. There, the how's yes cry of a hound passed and faded. We thought we had lost them, but the plantation men were relentless. A second wave of pursuers turned the night into a tide of noise. We abandoned the mule and ran into a reed bed where the water rose to our thighs and the mud tried to pull our feet away. Two men reached for Rosa, and I struck one with the knife we had hidden under the sack. He fell with a sound like a snapped branch. Another grabbed me, and a fight was close and ugly. I felt the knife go into my shoulder, and knew then that the price we paid would be paid in blood. The pain seared, and I tasted iron and earth and courage. We managed, by some force that was not only ours, to push through the last stand of trees and into a hollow, where voices became distant and the world felt like it might hold us for a little while. The quilombo we found was not the romanticized place of songs only. It was raw, constructed of makeshift homes, smoked meats hung from poles, and the vivid music of survival. When we stumbled into the clearing, the faces turned, wary and bright, and a woman with a broad smile and a scar across her knuckle stepped forward. Her name was Maria the midwife, and she pressed rosemary and a hot compress to my wound. An elder called Maestro Zé leaned on his atabaque and beat a slow rhythm with his eyes closed. Anna, the seamstress, unmade a dress to wrap the child, while Juan, the muleteer, who had once been a free man in name only, brought a pot of bean stew warmed by embers. Padre Manuel, who had risked leaving the chapel, stood at the fringes with a look that was both apology and resolve. Dona Lucia and Rosa's cousin Teresa came with salted fish and a plan. There was a young man named Carlos who taught the children letters, and a woman called Iara who tended the small garden and taught others how to plant cassava in a way that the soil would remember. 8 named faces and many unnamed hands gathered to make shelter, to clean my wound, to sing the child into being. The air in the quilombo tasted of sweat and coffee and new possibility. There were rituals of welcome, drums that pulled the skin of the world taut, and a prayer said in a mixture of Portuguese and rhythms that no law could define. For a few days I slept with the knife within reach, and woke to the sound of a tabaque. We called the baby Esperanza, even while our mouths feared the sacrilege of hope. The community taught me how to be free beyond the negation of the plantation. It taught me how to name my pain and how to turn it into story. But refuge breeds its own dangers, and the reprisal came like a storm.
Word moves fast, especially when anger sharpens it. The plantation sent men hired with coin and threats. They came at dawn with torches, a calculated violence designed to burn not only wood but memory. There were 3 moments that lasted like a long-held breath, and each unstitched some part of us. The first moment came at morning, when smoke began to rise like a column, and children started to cry. I grabbed Esperanza and ran toward the well, the heat making my scalp sting, the sweat a second skin. The second moment was a confrontation by the central hut, when Colonel Joaquim himself appeared, the man who had once wore a portrait like armor, now dirty and furious. He pointed at me and said, "You thought you could hide," and the crowd answered with a chorus of names and a single voice that said, "No more." Voices collided. A woman named Iara stepped between his men and a boy and said, "Leave the children," and a man in the group struck her to the ground. The sound of
Her fall felt like an axe. The third moment came as the attackers set fire to a house where the elders kept the records and the songs. The flames ate paper, and a long-held ledger that had names of births and arrivals went up with a crackle like bones. I remember holding Esperanza up as the air filled with smoke, and Anna the seamstress grabbing our hands and pulling us through a back path that smelled of wet earth and lilies. Those 2 paragraphs were the hinge of everything: hurt, resistance, and the sacrifice that turned us from a hidden refuge into a people who had been seen. In the middle of the chaos, Maestro Zé beat a rhythm that did not stop, even when a bullet took his arm, and he sang the ancestors' names as if each syllable could ward off the flames. People were hurt, and some did not wake. The cost was steep. The choice we had made had changed the calculus of survival for many. We had won nothing without paying. During the final confrontation which followed, the quilombo fought back with a ferocity honed by years of small resistances. The battle was not cinematic in the way songs make it seem. It was close, messy, and full of urgent small strategies. Men and women who had never killed in their lives took up sticks, machetes, and bones of broken tools. Padre Manuel preached to men who had never listened in the chapel, urging mercy and courage in the same breath. Rosa stood with a band of mothers protecting a line of children, and when the colonel moved toward the hut where Esperanza slept, I rose to meet him. We faced each other not as 2 men alone, but as the embodied histories of a country that had not yet decided who it wanted to be. The colonel made a lunge, and I responded with a thrust, and the world contracted to the point of metal and breath. I felt a second wound before a shout and a push took him down. In the end, the colonel did not die then, but he retreated with his men, cursing and bleeding. The victory was not total, and the loss was counted in names. Maestro Zé lost his arm. I bore scars across my shoulders, and my hands were raw from holding tools and infants. Yet something had shifted. The plantation could no longer move through the region with the same easy cruelty. The story of our resistance began to spread to nearby towns and to the ears of those who had profit to worry about. In the quiet moments after the last man's step faded, the quilombo gathered and sang a song that wandered through the trees and held our broken pieces together. 1 month later, the scene had settled into a shape that was both fragile and persistent. The scars were new and bright. Esperanza learned the taste of cassava bread and the sound of the atabaque. Maria the midwife had taught Rosa how to soothe a crying infant, and Anna the seamstress made small clothes. The community had rebuilt 2 huts and planted a new row of beans. News had spread to neighboring quilombos, and a messenger named Carlos traveled to gather support and information. A small committee formed to teach reading and to document the names of those who had been lost. The journal we had lost to fire was being rewritten from memory. People who had once been silent now named their lives aloud. There were funerals and there were small feasts. Sales in the nearby town had changed where certain goods could be bought because the story of the fight made it dangerous for merchants to support plantations openly. There was a feeling of fragile reprieve that could snap if the wrong hand moved. We planted a memorial of stones where the burnt hut had stood, and every evening someone placed a piece of fruit on it. The rhythm of daily life resumed in a new key. 3 months later, there was movement beyond the trees. Other quilombos had begun to form alliances, and a network was being woven, slow and careful, by people who had learned to use the same rhythms of secrecy that had kept them hidden for years. Padre Manuel had been removed from his chapel by men who feared his defiance, but he found us instead and taught the children how to read letters from travelers who were sympathetic. Dona Lucia returned with a basket of seeds and the knowledge of a spice that made soups taste like home no matter how poor the broth. Rosa began teaching other young mothers how to sing to their children in ways that were both lullaby and code. Legal whispers reached the town hall, and an insignificant clerk named Antonio began to file complaints and petitions, small gestures that gave our fight a paper echo. We wrote the name of Esperanza into a cloth and stitched it into a banner that flew over our camps on market days. Songs we had kept in memory spread like new shoots. The cost remained. Some had been taken, others had been wounded, and the colonel still moved in pockets of the region with men and money. But a new thing had entered the world, a shared courage that other people could borrow. The presence of our resistance began to shape the calculations of those who profited from silence. 6 months after that terrible night, things had shifted in ways that would ripple beyond our fields and fires. The quilombo grew into a constellation of small settlements connected by trade and by the movement of people and stories. Maria the midwife organized a traveling clinic that taught midwifery, basic wound care, and herbal remedies. Maestro Zé, who had lost his arm, learned to play rhythms that made the atabaque sing with one hand, and the whole community learned to hear the old songs. As maps of survival, Carlos and João had created a courier route that brought news to distant places, and sometimes smuggled letters and seeds and books. The name of the colonel had become a cautionary tale in nearby markets. Donations appeared from unexpected places. A woman in a coastal town sent cloth, a baker brought extra loaves, and a small group of freed people brought seeds of a crop that grew strong in poor soils. Esperanza learned to walk and then to run, her laughter a sound that unmoored sorrow in the most stubborn hearts. We established a small school beneath a large mango tree where children learned reading, counting, and the songs of our people. The acts of memory became institutionalized in small ways. A day marked to recall the people we lost, a ledger kept in the care of Anna the seamstress, rituals performed at each harvest to honor the ancestors. Our story began to be told in other villages, and a pamphlet with the title Freedom and Memory circulated in a few places. It was not yet enough to end the system that had birthed the colonel, but it had become a seedbed for questions that would not be easily answered by the men who wanted silence. We had made a home out of resistance, and in doing so, we had made a promise to the next generation. When the smoke cleared and the wounds began to heal, something remained unburned: memory. That is the weapon that cannot be taken. Remembering is an act of justice. We taught Esperanza to sing the songs her grandmother once hummed, to hold the atabaque with reverence, to count names, and to keep a ledger of small mercies. People from other places began to visit, to learn how a community made itself whole again. If this story has touched you, leave a comment below about what name you would give a child who represents freedom. Share this video to keep the memory alive. Subscribe to hear other voices that history tried to bury, because remembering is the first form of justice, and together we keep it burning.